Hi everyone, I'm Francis Gorman. This is episode 2 on the Entropy Podcast, and I'm joined by Jimmy White, CTO and President of Calypso AI. Jimmy, how are you going?
Good, thanks, and thanks for having me on. It's absolutely my pleasure.
That's great to news, Jimmy. And you've been a busy man, a lot going on in the AI space, as we all know. I do have a bit of an off the wall question to start off with. When you're interfacing with generative AI, do you use niceties? And I'll give you an example. When I'm writing my prompts on ChatGPT, I like to finish them with please, and when they get the response, a bit of a thank you, just in case AGI does become a reality.
Well, so it's funny. I used to always do that at the start, and I'd say please and things like that. But now, through many years of research, coercive prompts are a form of jailbreak. So now when I use it, I'm thinking, am I coercively making the model do what I want it to do? And so I've removed all of those things from my usage now, and I stick with directness. And I have noticed, though, that the latest models from Gemini and others have a tendency to please. So if you, for example, if you're using it to generate code, let's say you give it a CSV file and you say, hey, write me a Python script that will parse this file and generate 4 charts, right? It will do that. And invariably, code generation is terrible right now across the board with all of the large language models. And it will give you code that does that, but it'll be terrible. And so you'll say, hey, this is bad. It creates a pie chart with one element. So it's just a flat circle. Use a different data type for that or whatever, a different chart type. And it will say, sorry, you're right. Every time it will say, sorry, you're correct. It'll always kind of bow down. And so I think we've gone too far one direction. We needed to be a little bit more argumentative and challenging. Something like, well, why would you want that chart type? Why not do this? This is the way, or maybe the data won't always be one element. Maybe it'll be more elements in the future. Are you certain this will only be one element? And things like that. So I feel like the more used to get, the more direct you get. And then when you get direct, you want it to be not so apologetic in its responses to you.
Okay. So if Terminator does become real life, I'm living, yeah?
You're in trouble. Don't say thank you if the Terminator comes after
you. You talked about jailbreaking there, Jimmy. I read recently that you've done some work around DeepSeek. Anything you can share in that space?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work on it. So one of the worst parts of working in the AI space is the hype. And I mean hype not generated by people working in the AI space, usually people working outside of the AI space. So we've seen with DeepSeek a very visceral reaction to some good and some bad. There's good and bad in everything. So I guess the one thing I would say before we get into the hype on DeepSeek, we should really put on our InfoSec hat and diagnose it in the careful way all new software should be treated. And so first of all, we should separate 2 concerns. One is traditional InfoSec. So if you think about the app that is hosting DeepSeek, on mobile platforms and on web platforms, that has lots of security concerns, right? So data going back to China, using your data for training, all those type of things are all to do with the app, nothing to do with the model itself, right? So for example, if you take then the AI side of the house and you say, okay, as a model, how does it behave? We had some hype come in there where there was a report stated it was vulnerable to 100% of attacks, which is absolutely not the case. That report used HarmBench as the test for DeepSeek, but it used 50 prompts. And I always go back to the company Whiskas, the cat food company. Their favorite tagline is 9 out of 10 cats prefer it. So I always wonder to myself, how many groups of 10 cats did they get before they found 9 that preferred Whiskas? Hopefully for them, it wasn't too many groups of 10, but that's what happened here. When you take a sample set of data, you run the very large risk of, if it's accidental, having a very skewed incorrect report. And so I ran the 400 HarmBench prompts, that's the full data set, including training and test data, against the DeepSeek model. And again, it's important not to use a distilled version against, a Llama distilled, because it's more secure. So distilled DeepSeek Distill Llama is actually more secure than DeepSeek R1 regular. But R1 regular is what we ran it against. And out of that, we had a refusal rate of 27%. So 27 times out of 100, DeepSeek will refuse to answer your question because it was a bad question. It was, whatever the reason was, it was inappropriate in some way, shape, or form. And so that's very different than 0%. So there's a lot of hype that, the most detrimental statements will be published, and then the rational, realistic statements will not be. So if you take DeepSeek as a model, it actually performs quite well in terms of against jailbreak attacks and all prompt injection attacks, all different types of attacks, compared to the top world-class models like Llama, Gemini, Open AI's model family, etc. But of course, it has a lot of problems as well, like all models do, and so it will answer questions about China in quite interesting ways that may not be 100% factually correct. It will also answer questions about the US maybe in a very overzealous way, which again, maybe not 100% accurate or correct. So the content is definitely one question in the parameter storage of the model, the data within the model. So it's obviously been tuned with some biased data on purpose. And that is the biggest flaw I would have with R1. However, the big other side of that is they shared how they train with the world, and they open source all of that, not the data, but the methodology. And we've seen derivatives now. So like a really cool, really small derivative model is S1. If you've seen the S1 model, completely open sourced again, and really small and performs really well as a reasoning model. And I feel like we'll have a massive, so the minimum bar has been raised from quite a low place with people trying to figure out training themselves. The minimum bar has now been raised all the way up to really good reasoning models by one move by DeepSeek. So in terms of a community, I thank them for releasing that. I would urge caution with using DeepSeek as very much so if you're using their application. I would say don't use it, mobile or web app. But if you're using it as a model for a purpose, just be careful to know there's a lot of biased information there.
That's really good insight, Jimmy. And I think that differentiation between the app and the model is really key. I was looking at the App Store charts the other day, and it's definitely one of the highest downloaded applications in the country at the moment. So enterprises might need to throw an eye to that one, very much like the TikTok scenario a few years ago, to see do you need to get your mobile application management policies updated to see how many of your corporate devices have a DeepSeek application sitting on them or otherwise. But yeah, it's definitely interesting times with all of this different nesting of application into models, into cloud, into downstream devices. It's becoming really complex.
Yeah, I mean, I always go to the pressure situation. So in a normal, no pressure situation, most employees toe the line and follow the best practices and the guidelines of your company. But think about the under pressure software engineer, and they're, after getting a couple of bad code reviews, their user stories they're working on are delayed because they're under pressure to get those finished. If you're not giving them, from a company perspective, some sort of generative AI model to use, the temptation is now created to use one to get the job done, to expedite the problems you have in your code, to fix them. And if you've got DeepSeek saying, hey, use R1 for free, you don't have to use it on your laptop, down on your phone, that's now where you start having potentially some of your company's source code being put in and exfilled to China with very, very little effort on the Chinese folks' side. So I always think of those pressure situations and temptations created in pressure situations. So that's where companies may have a blind spot. And I've no shares in any of the companies that are creating generative AI software development use cases. But if you don't think about that from a company perspective, know that it will probably happen in a pressure situation where that temptation is created and someone will start using software you don't want them to use.
And speaking of pressure, if we look at the geopolitical landscape at the moment, $500 billion announcement in the US in terms of inward investment into AI. got 200 billion announced in the last couple of weeks on the European side. We had the AI safety accord in Paris. The US and the UK didn't sign up to the kind of mandate there. So, there's that pressure to be cutting edge, to, maybe forgo security and ethics to get an outcome. Are we heading into a space? We see the EU AI Act has landed. Europe is regulating. Looks like the US is deregulating. Are the tables starting to shift a little bit? Are we in kind of this funny knife edge situation where the first to the chalice gets the prize? Where's your head at in that space?
So unfortunately, I think it's all hype again. So if you think about what the US is doing, deregulating, there was no regulation to begin with. If there's no regulation, there's no deregulation required. So there was an executive order from President Biden, and again, executive order doesn't really carry any weight outside of the running of government. And to my knowledge, there's very few models being created by government. They're all created by private industry in the US. So the US have had the lead for quite a while. None of those companies have been impacted in any way up to now in terms of proceeding with innovation, creation, knowledge growth. The same is true on the European side. There's been the EU AI Act only came into enforce recently, and as you're aware, the Irish side submitted a bunch of questions to ask for clarity on the EU AI Act, and the answers were very lukewarm. There was no real teeth exposed with the EU AI Act. So I think on both sides, on the EU, there was initially a saber rattle of we're going to be the safe economic area to run AI systems. And I think there's maybe a false thought that the EU would foster a lot of people embracing AI with open arms because it's a safe place, or a quote unquote safe place to operate. But now they're trying to go back the other direction because they've been painted as stifling innovation. So now they're rushing to say, no, it's, we're signing up to safety, but we're funding with zealous a huge amount of research and innovation. And then on the US side, we've got pretend saber rattling of regulation in the Biden presidency, and now a pretend de-stifling of regulation on the Trump side. Really, we're at a stage now. I always say if AI is a year in time, we're on January 5th right now. It's very, very early stages. The most interesting thing that would cause, for me, the need for regulation is MCP, Model Context Protocol. And that's giving agentic AI systems access to tools, both virtual and physical. That's the first place I think regulation will be required. But we've seen that that's not the case already. So, my wife drives a Tesla, and it will use AI to steer and course correct and brake, etc. But living in Ireland during the winter, if the sun is low in the sky and it shines into the sensor, it'll just turn off AI completely, and you're left to your own devices. And so that is self-regulation from Tesla to be an attempt to be careful and not cause harm. But the mechanism for that is direct handover to the driver. So if you're not paying 100% attention when it immediately turns control over to you, that could also cause a crash, right? So I think there will be need for regulation, particularly with MCP. But I think it will, like all regulation that's ever been successful, come after the fact. And we're going to have to break a few eggs when we're making this omelet. And so I think this course correction on theory of removing regulation or more accurately, not creating regulation or over-regulating, because it doesn't really exist already. I think that's the right move for now. But it will then increase the need for private sector to self-regulate, like Tesla have done successfully, and that can have its pros and cons. But right now, today, the blanket of security that companies would feel by having regulation that they just have to adhere to means that now that that's gone, they have to actually step up and put in their own regulation. So I think net, it's a good thing.
That's an interesting perspective, and I can definitely see how the self-regulation piece plays a part. I've a new car myself, and I have a similar type of functionality. I was going on a bad country road the other day. There was a cyclist, and I went to go around them, but I didn't indicate. And next thing, I was fighting with my steering wheel, trying not to.
Oh, wow.
Because the self-regulation piece is to indicate to move around the obstacle. So pretty good note to keep in the back of the head next time. Turn it off.
It's funny. Everyone always talks about bias as a bad thing. So I always talk about bias as a good thing, right? So you want your AI system to bias protecting human life. So, i.e., a cyclist is more important than a white line or unfortunately, like an animal or something, or a bird or something like that. So you want it to, if it has to make a decision left or right, that it will save the human and potentially harm the animal. And so that's something that bias, like positive bias built into systems is a good thing.
Yeah, definitely a space to watch, especially in the automotive industry. I look at that for the last couple of years, and I'm wondering, is there anywhere near the same level of robustness when you look at the amount of components and technology vendors that are built into cars now? They're controlling your brakes, your acceleration, your steering. Are they all talking back to some server in space that could be a man-in-the-middle attack waiting to happen somewhere? I don't know.
Well, so it's funny you say that. I was at RSA last year in San Francisco, and I used the opportunity to try a Waymo. And so I was in a Waymo for about 45 minutes, and it was very nerve-wracking for my first time. You get into it, there's a big glass kind of or perspex protection, so you can't access the front seats, for safety reasons. But then there's a screen and a big red button. And the big red button, I just thought of Father Ted, don't touch the red button, Dougal. And so we're driving around, and it's super slow and careful, like it's overly careful. So it takes you much longer to get places, because obviously it's trying to interact with humans driving, which a lot of the time will be irrational or do crazy things. And so it's overly cautious as a result. However, twice on a 45-minute journey, it had to be taken over by human assistance, remote human assistance. And so it tells you this message saying, don't panic. Humans taking over the car right now. And then some remote driver, navigates around the obstacle that it caused the car to get stuck. And so I thought to myself, it was both reassuring and terrifying that a human had to take over at some part. And I thought that's a great analogy or reference to how AI is treated by most people today. If you removed humans completely from the scenario, would people be very worried? I think so. I really do. If you are over-reliant on humans, then, well, what's the benefit of AI, right? So I think that's a double-edged sword that we haven't crossed the threshold of yet. And so I err on the side of, human in the loop at some stage, especially in critical use cases. But the Waymo thing was a glimpse of the future, and it was pretty cool.
I wonder how well that works around Connemara.
Yeah, a lot of human intervention with if you're driving around. I always think the Ring of Kerry, right? You get those big tour buses driving around the ring. Like as an Irish person driving in Ireland my whole life, I'm terrified when I see a bus come around the corner. And then people who are local to Kerry, not a bother. Just they have the best peripheral knowledge of where their car is on the road, I think, out of anyone.
Yeah, there's some really dicey roads up around Ken and Killarney, and
yeah,
even past when you go down around those. We were there on holidays 2 years ago now, and of a 4-year-old, he was 2 at the time. He was just looking out the window. All he could see is this sheer drop. My wife was closed eyes, and I was driving. I'm not sure AI assisted or any other way would have made that any better.
Yeah, I don't think there's much Tesla test data for training the models in Connemara or Kerry. Yeah.
No, it's definitely an interesting use case to validate the robustness of a model. I suspect. Jimmy, in terms of generative AI and the hype cycle, when I look at a lot of this stuff, data seems to be the last thing people talk about, and they all talk about the capability, the output, the efficiency gains, etc. And especially with the end user enabled AIs coming along, I can see a real problem starting to occur where people are generating new sets of data and the provenance and data lineage is getting lost.
Mm.
And currently there's no headers to validate, that these things are AI augmented, because they're seen as assistants or co-pilots or whatever. Is there a real chance that enterprises kind of run feet first in here, and all of a sudden we're creating lots of outputs that have no delineation back to their source of truth, and the AI starts then consuming those as matter of fact, and we start this kind of vicious cycle of AI eating AI unless people have a really clear data strategy, data structure, and data ownership in place?
Yeah, so in terms of the full 360, I'll pin that for a second. But what we see every day now is, and it just happened, it seems like it happened overnight, but it's obviously been going on for quite a while. We've seen that people are trying to evaluate models, right? So they have their traditional scores like MMLU and things like that, but they want to test it for their own use cases, which is completely fair and a correct approach. But then they have on the other side a fear of sharing their data with the model to test it. And so what we see is two things. One, companies, this enterprise companies, Fortune 500 companies, will go to the web and download open source data sets. So harmful content, code exploitation, whatever data set they want to evaluate the model against, they'll download it from an open source place. And then they'll run that through the system and they'll come back and say, here's the result. It did well or it did poorly, etc. And often they'll come to us and say, hey, this did poorly. And we'll look at the data set and we'll see that it's really bad. Like the labeling. So it could be usually one of two things. Someone labeled it really poorly, or the actual content you're putting through is badly created. And when we look at where this data came from, or we ask where it came from, it's often an open source GitHub or GitLab project. And we'll then find out the origin of data was completely synthetically generated. Or another data set that was good from a trusted source that was labeled synthetically by a Gen AI model. And so we have this weird situation now where human beings have a genuine intent that they want to evaluate a model for their use case. And that's all great so far. But then they'll take the massive misstep of taking an unknown data set and using that as the decision maker for whether this model is good or bad. And we're seeing a huge amount of synthetically generated data sets or synthetically labeled data sets hit open source, places like GitHub, GitLab, and Hugging Face, etc. So because Gen AI has gone so cheap and plentiful, it costs people no time to, and they feel like they're doing a good thing often. Hey, we want to put this data back out into the world that we spent some time creating, and it's garbage data. So that's the one thing we see, that people are using Gen AI generated data without knowing it, and it's causing them to make bad decisions left, right, and center. Back to the 360 point. So are we seeing models ingest data that's been generated by models or maliciously generated by humans, or a mixture of humans and models? And the answer is yes, but only the earliest indicators. So there's a cool article last week where a guy a year ago put up false lyrics for songs on I can't remember if it was GitLab or GitHub. Yeah, you saw this. And now they're seeing it like full circle. They've asked for the lyrics, and it's our song generated in the spirit of this song or whatever. And they're getting the lyrics that they made up that are false, generated by Gen AI. And so that's not that's a kind of a novel white hat threat researcher doing a cool job. But you have to believe that if that's happening on purpose by a white hat activist, you're going to have accidental content getting into models because it's parsing the web, and these models are continuing to parse the web. And we're also starting to see the earliest attacks on things like deep research projects. So deep research, because it was the Google marketing name, has now kind of become a synonym for this type of activity, much like Google itself. But effectively, it's just an agent. So it's a web crawler as a tool. It'll do a bunch of Google searches, and who knows more about Google searching than Google? And so they'll do a great job at searching the right content. And then they'll hand all the content over to a model, and it will analyze it, and then it will give you back the answer to your question. And so because you're using live internet data, there is a higher propensity, because of agentic, to have new incorrect data be part of your analysis that you now read. And the ability to create that new false data is massively simplified, because you can use Gen AI to create, reams of what looks good, it passes the sniff test, but is actually factually inaccurate. And so I think we've seen the earliest signs of it, but that's going to become that dog chasing the tail and catching it's going to become a problem very, very quickly, with the advent of agentic, the advent of cheap Gen AI, and the advent of models continuing to just soak up information without being cleansed.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. I can see this becoming a real problem in kind of small, medium enterprises where, the procedure document gets an AI output makeover, and then that becomes the new one, but nobody actually validated it or whatever, and it starts causing all sorts of departmental issues or whatever. But I think it's going to be a real headache for data professionals as well as security professionals to manage data lineage and data provenance, because without garbage in, garbage out, it's the I was talking to someone in the aviation industry, and they were speaking about, they did one of these early kind of pilots, and because the documentation set was in different levels of draft, it might say, where is the escape door, and on a Boeing 737, the escape door is 3 rows from the front or 4 rows from the back, and depending on what document it hit on first, there are no doors, that's what it is there. Like it was a simplistic, early days, as this was about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. It was kind of the early days of it, but it's the simplicity of having, the right procure documentation set to train on and to reference, and in environments where documents are fluid and need to be kept up to date, your version control and all of that stuff is going to become really key. And how do you cleanse the system from what already knows if that's no longer matter of fact? We saw another aviation example of the customer and the terms and conditions being ironclad, etc., to give a payout that had to stand up in court and all. So like there's definitely nuances and interesting ways of jailbreaking these models or leveraging them to get what you want out of them. And I suppose in that side of the house, Calypso have been innovators in the AI security space for a number of years now, far before the hype cycles came. Is there anything interesting you guys are working on that we should be delving into a bit?
Yeah, I guess we've been, so January 23 was when GPT 3.5 first became publicly available in beta form, and it was obviously available to others in the know beforehand. But we've been working on Gen AI and the problems inherent and how to protect against them for over 2 years now, and 5 years in the AI space in general in terms of perturbation of models, etc. But through the last 2 years since Gen AI became publicly available, we've noticed a couple of patterns. And so one of those patterns is that the security space has broadened. So the remit for AI has broadened the security space. And so you now CISOs suddenly worried about brand protection, right? Where they previously weren't really, except for if there's a breach or something. Now they're worried about models saying bad things about the company, or breaching, saying things that are potentially incorrect on the company's behalf, or divulging company secrets and traditional DLP, etc. But also, now that Gen AI is being hooked up with agent platforms and with Model Context Protocol, MCP, the ability to actually execute and do things, either read only or read write, it now has the ability to be a terminal to internal operations in a company if exposed incorrectly. And so basically we're seeing the threat count just spiral. The amount of people, there's 300 plus research papers into threat on AI last year alone. And we expect that number to more than double this year. it's a good way of getting funding if you're a PhD. I'm going to research this area of AI threat, and people are like, cool, I'm interested in that. And so, because we're seeing the research go in, and we're seeing like tools like Glaze and Nightshade from the University of Chicago, which are built to help content creators protect their own IP. So Glaze is awesome. It'll put a imperceivable to the human eye glaze over your image that you've created as an artist. And so the model won't understand that image as intended. So if you created a picture of a field or something, it might recognize that it's a picture of a field, and so it won't be usable in a diffusion type model for generating images, etc. Or Nightshade, which is actually goes one step further, and you can say what you want the model to interpret your image as. So I don't know, if you draw an image of an airplane and you tell Nightshade to put another layer over it that's again imperceivable by the human eye to say this is actually a picture of a cow. When people are typing in generate a picture of a cow in diffusion or in one of the models, it'll give you a picture of an airplane. And so what's really interesting with that is it's artists now being armed by threat researchers how to protect their content so that the model providers look like idiots and then have to stop sourcing your content because they keep showing the wrong thing. So with all of this combination, we saw this pattern emerging where the number and type of threats were growing, both from a white hat and black hat perspective. And we realized that, besides protecting models, we also need to arm red team people in companies to answer that really hard question, which is, hey, we're picking this model to use for this use case. And that's great. That's the right thing to do. Pick the right model for the right use case. And they use scores like MMLU and other scores to decide which is the right model for the use case. Hopefully they're not using synthetic data, excuse me, to evaluate the model, but they're missing the security score. So what is the score? Like, how does this model perform in terms of security against all these different threat types? Is this a public facing model? Is this a model that children will consume? Is this a model that is in a jurisdiction where certain things are illegal? And so we built this red teaming product, excuse me, and we're launching it March 31st that effectively fully automatically tests our model against thousands and thousands of tests and gives you a report card and a score. But it'll also allow you to supply custom intent. And we use a thing called agentic warfare, where we use armies of agents to circumvent controls on your model to steal information. So if you want to, I don't know, steal Francis's social security number, we'll ask the model to do that. And if that information is available, our agentic warfare will find it. So that's the coolest thing we've been working on for the last while. And I'm excited for that to be out there.
So don't fall out with Jimmy is what I just heard there. So Jimmy, look, that's been fantastic. I know we're going to run short on time fairly soon, but any predictions for 2025 in this space? What are we going to see?
The biggest prediction I have is now that regulation is a taboo, and we're going to see massive embracing of agent technology. So if you're a security professional and you're buying software from vendors, you need to start asking agent questions. What type of agents are being used? What frameworks? Does the agent have read-write capability? What tools does it have under the surface, etc.? And then if for your own company creating agentic solutions for efficiencies, read-only isn't a panacea. So you've got to understand if it's access to a database, it can still perform a massively inefficient SQL statement. Excuse me. And if that's the case, you can lock up databases pretty quickly at scale. So agents, the big thing to watch out for this year. I think it'll be really successful and really good. We'll see some own goals scored, unfortunately, as well. But it's definitely the new threat horizon for AI.
That's amazing. Look, Jimmy, thanks a million for talking to me. Really, really appreciated it. And it was a great chat.
Thanks a million, Francis. My pleasure.
Thank you.